Unveiling Canada's most disturbing expedition ever. Before Sir John Franklin became the name behind one of the Victorian era's greatest mysteries, the Arctic voyage that would vanish in 1845, he led another journey into the far north that left scars on those who survived it and on the reputation of the British Admiralty. That earlier attempt, the Coppermine Expedition of 1819 to 1822, is quieter in the long shadow of later tragedies, but its record is no less stark. Men reduced to eating boiled leather, caches of promised stores that never arrive, a young officer found shot, and a chain of accusations that would haunt survivors for decades. This is the story of how imperial ambition, poor planning, and the brutal logic of survival intersected on a map that was still being drawn. They set out with maps pinned to hope. Britain, having emerged from the Napoleonic Wars, turned its naval energy from fleets of war to a new kind of conquest, the charting of the Northwest Passage. To the men issuing orders in London, a navigable route across the top of North America promised commercial shortcuts and imperial prestige. To Sir John Barrow, second Secretary of the Admiralty and the public architect of Arctic campaigns, the passage was a test of national nerve and scientific reach. Barrow's interventions would shape a generation of expeditions, but his zeal also masked a pattern: ambitious directives backed by constrained budgets and a willingness to rely on ad hoc partnerships rather than first-rate logistics. Franklin's Coppermine mission fit into this pattern. It was not a grand squadron armed with the state-of-the-art provisions of later polar expeditions. Instead, it was a modest naval detachment tasked with inland exploration, to chart the northern coast east of the Coppermine River, to make observations of natural history, and to open routes that might one day connect Atlantic and Pacific waters. The Admiralty's aims were grand, the purse strings were not. That contrast between declared purpose and available means would be a persistent theme in the narrative that followed. The party that left England in 1819 was small by naval colonial standards, but large enough to be unwieldy in the wilderness. John Franklin, then a relatively seasoned officer, commanded the expedition. His second-in-command, Dr. John Richardson, doubled as naturalist and surgeon, a man whose journals would become one of the primary sources for what happened. Younger officers, including George Back and Robert Hood, brought energy and ability. Experienced seamen, such as John Hepburn, supplied practical skill. Among the non-British participants were Métis voyageurs and native guides, whose knowledge of rivers and ice would prove indispensable. Most crucial among them was Accusations, leader of the Yellowknives, whose influence and goodwill were vital to the expedition's survival.
If the composition of the team showed some good sense, a balance of naval discipline and local expertise, other elements of the preparation did not. The Admiralty's funding was tight. In the field, Franklin relied on arrangements with fur companies to provide supplies and transport. That bargain was frayed from the start. The Hudson's Bay Company and its rivals operated in a world where profit motive, competition, and the exigencies of trade trumped the steady delivery of promised caches. Promises made in London often ran into realities shaped by distance, weather, and the priorities of traders. For men counting on prepositioned stores along their route, that fragile supply chain would make the difference between endurance and collapse. The expedition's plan asked a lot. The route would push from Hudson Bay inland across hundreds of miles, following rivers and portages to the Great Slave Lake, and then northward toward the Coppermine River and the Arctic coast beyond. In total, Franklin's party would cover roughly 1,700 miles of rough and often unmapped terrain. Much of that distance would be achieved by canoe, hauled across rapids, and portaged through muskeg and rock. The summer travel season in the north is mercilessly brief. Rivers that provide a highway one week can freeze or become impassable the next. Weather, always the invisible commander in these regions, dictated the rhythm of the journey. They arrived at Fort Enterprise on the shores of a lake south of Great Slave Lake in late 1819 and early 1820, after a succession of portages, rapids, and setbacks. Fort Enterprise itself was to be a temporary deposit point, a place where caches of supplies would be stored for the men who would push north the following year. Establishing such caches was standard practice for inland expeditions. They transformed a linear, tenuous journey into one punctuated by known havens. The saving of lives depended on those promises. The first winter at Fort Enterprise, however, exposed the fragility of that promise. The fur traders who controlled movement in the region had not been coaxed into flawless cooperation. Harsh winter conditions hampered movement. Rival companies and a tangle of leases and loyalties complicated delivery. More insidiously, the expedition's budget constrained the volume and quality of stores the Admiralty would authorize. The journals of Richardson and others make clear what followed. Stores intended to replenish the expedition failed to arrive in the anticipated quantity or at the expected time. Those modern bureaucratic failures translated into a very human catastrophe: hunger, anxiety, and the slow erosion of trust. It is easy to translate these facts into grand moral judgments about leadership, but the situation was also shaped by the thin, contingent lines that held Arctic life together.
The Yellowknives, led by Akaicho, had reasons to support Franklin: trade goods, promises of future relations, and perhaps a genuine desire to help men who had proven themselves fair in earlier encounters. Yet their capacities were not limitless. When traders and guide networks could no longer deliver, Franklin and his officers faced a choice: stay put and starve, or push forward into terrain that would offer no guaranteed relief. The journals give a paso account that avoids decoration but accumulates dread. Richardson, skillful in observation and precise about dates and rationing measures, recorded the small collapses that add up to calamity. He noted, clinically, the quantities of flour and salted meat consumed, the condition of men whose feet froze after long portages, the way tea would congeal when left near an open window, and how mercury could be seen to stiffen in winter temperatures. These are not theatrical flourishes. They are the material register of a world growing hostile to human habit. Early morale fractures appeared in the routine of hunger. Men hoarded where they could. Theft was suspected. There were moments that would later be read as precursors to mutiny. Small acts of insubordination, a canoe left at a worse point on the river, a contingent refusing an order, were less about military discipline than the breakdown of social contract under stress. A crew that had once moved together with a shared mission began to fragment into those who conserved and those who consumed, into those who were willing to risk everything for the chance of fresh meat, and those who insisted on adhering to rationed fairness. Akaicho's role in this period is important and instructive. Far from being a background figure, he exercised power in practical terms. His men guided travel, hunted, and traded. When the expedition's stores dwindled, Akaicho and the Yellowknives provided the immediate substance of life. Their hunting skills, knowledge of caribou patterns, of where muskox might be found, of the seasonality of fish runs, bought time and delayed calamity. Yet the help was not inexhaustible. The economics of the fur trade meant that Akaicho's generosity had limits and conditions. To frame him merely as a rescuer understates the reciprocity at play. Guides sought trade benefits, relationship capital, and not least the stability of relations with the imperial power represented by Franklin. As winter yielded to spring and then to the cruel brevity of the northern summer, the party prepared to push northward. The prospect of mapping uncharted coastlines, of planting the British flag in hitherto unknown places, carried with it a moral haze, the seductive promise that achievement could erase the memory of suffering. Yet the logistics were not corrected. Damaged canoes, worn clothing, and the thinness of the winter provisions still shadowed every choice. Even when the weather allowed travel, river crossings could be treacherous. One broken canoe might strand a contingent. An ice-choked stream might add days of delay. Delays worsened hunger, and the journals show a continuous concern with rations: how much flour remained, what meat could be salted for storage, which men were losing weight faster than others. The memory of that period returns in small, telling details. Richardson mentions, in a passage that readers and historians have returned to again and again, the men resorting to consuming boiled leather, a phrase that signals improvisation born of desperation. Strips of boot leather, tough and unpalatable, were softened in hot water and eaten simply to stave off the pangs of starvation. Another recurring detail appears in descriptions of the bitter cold. Tea freezing in kettles at the edge of camps, mercury and thermometers becoming viscous in a way that suggested the world itself was hardening. These were not theatrical metaphors. They were precise indicators of environment intersecting with human need. Tension within the ranks was not only about food. It involved questions of authority and the distribution of blame. Franklin, trained in naval command, expected order. His officers expected deference. But the rules of that order had been fashioned for a different environment. In the wilderness, leadership needed to be adaptive, generous in judgment, and pragmatic enough to bend without breaking. Where Franklin and others held to strictures that worked at sea, the slow compromises required on land could feel like weakness to some and like savior to others. Disputes over hunting allowances, the use of trade goods, reward for guides, and the place of the Métis voyageurs all became and remained sources of friction, often recorded in the journals as terse notations that hint at larger resentments. By the end of that first harsh winter, the party had a new and unwelcome literacy, how close they were to collapse. James Dasent, an imagined petty incident, or more concretely, small acts of defiance and theft, were logged in the margins of more important scientific notes. The cumulative effect was to make the expedition fragile in ways that money could not immediately resolve. With supplies at Fort Enterprise uneven and the promised caches farther north unreliable, the men were forced to make decisions that would have moral as well as practical consequences. They pushed on because the logic of expedition demanded movement. To stay often meant death by attrition. To move carried the hazard of immediate catastrophe. Rivers must be followed, passes negotiated, and the mapping work carried out in hopes that the work itself, charts, latitude and longitude readings, observations of flora and fauna, would justify the suffering. The party achieved some of these aims. Despite their privations, they produced maps and notes that extended European knowledge of the coastline east of the Coppermine.
They recorded, with the careful eyes of trained naturalists, new species and geological formations. These achievements mattered, and they would be used by the Admiralty and by future explorers. But the maps and the specimens could not readily reconcile with the condition of the men who carried them, a dissonance that would come back to haunt Franklin's reputation. The mood grew darker as the expedition moved into the Barren Lands, a stretch of northward tundra that removes the consolations of tree and tall vegetation and substitutes them with an openness so empty it feels like an accusation. Portages lengthened, cold sharpened into a near-constant companion. Canoes freighted with the scant remains of clothing and equipment were sometimes shredded on hidden shoals. One damaged craft could mean days of repair and the loss of precious meat and flour. It was here, amid the monotonous gray of stone and moss, that social collapse became more than a theoretical risk. The journals become more insistent in these moments. Men are noted as quiet, as missing the laughter they once shared. Hunting parties returned with less than was expected. Caches that had been marked on earlier maps were found empty or improperly located. Small betrayals accrued, a barrel of flour gone, smoked meat eaten without accounting, a cache opened in secret. When property and survival overlap so completely, suspicion becomes a survival mechanism. Entries in Richeson's notebook reveal the language of suspicion. Observations recorded about the state of stores, about who had been seen near certain caches, about the dirt on boots, and the lingering scent of cooked meat. Historians who later examined these documents would debate whether these notes indicate widespread theft or, more plausibly, a few individuals taking desperate measures in an environment where usual moral constraints fray quickly. Among the figures who loomed in this atmosphere was a man named Michel. He is one of the most controversial characters in the Coppermine narrative, and his story is exemplary of how the fog of survival can turn into a haze of accusation. Michel was a voyageur whose actions during the retreat would be the focus of suspicion. Several survivors later alleged that Michel had been returning repeatedly to the scene of a cache with meat in his possession, while others reported that he spoke inconsistently about the source of his provisions. Documentation on these episodes exists in the journals, but it is fragmentary and often colored by the stress under which entries were made. Contemporary accounts suggest that men wondered whether Michel was hoarding game, stealing from caches, or at worst supplying himself at the expense of others. These were allegations that would feed into a larger narrative of mistrust. The death of Robert Hood, a young officer and artist who had been tasked with recording the expedition's scenes and specimens, would crystallize the horror for many. Hood was found shot. The wound was in his back, and the circumstances were murky. Some contemporaries called it an accident. Others did not. Richardson, Hepburn, and a handful of the officers record an event that was both tragic and inexplicable. The journals do not offer a neat scene where motive and action line up as in a courtroom drama. Instead, the record shows a violent rupture, whose exact mechanics and motives are the subject of later reconstruction and debate. What follows in the primary accounts is not a single clear judgment, but a series of observations. A man shot, a body examined, testimonies recorded in the cold, and the emergence of fear among those who remained. Accusations flew. When men suspected that someone among them had concealed meat, the implications were huge.
Survival in the Arctic is zero-sum in the sense that resources are neither easily replenished nor plentiful. If one person hoarded, another may starve. When a death occurred under such conditions, suspicion hardened into a conspiracy of rationales. Had theft led directly to the deprivation that caused the death? Or had greed and fear escalated into violence? The record shows that these questions were asked, sometimes in careful language, sometimes in bitter accusations, but it does not yield a definitive, incontrovertible answer that historians can claim without qualification. It is at this point, winter worn thin, stores unreliable, morale waning, suspicion circulating, that the Coppermine Expedition turns from a story of exploration into something more ambiguous and deeply unsettling. The men who kept the journals did so in order to tell what they had seen and done. Their pages are full of latitude and longitude, specimen lists, and the cold arithmetic of rations. Interwoven with that clinical material are personal notes that betray the stress, the thinning of faces, the extra hours awake watching caches, the terse complaints. Here the documentary voice becomes a witness to psychological corrosion. Still, there were moments of practical heroism and small kindness that resist complete vilification. Akaicho's people continued to show up when they could to bring food and to guide. Some men shared their last biscuit. Others abandoned their own comforts to assist a comrade with a frozen foot. The historical picture is not monochrome. It is fractured and lived in gray. By late summer of 1821, the party stood at a crossroads. They had mapped substantial stretches of coastline and made observations that would later inform both science and navigation, but the cost had been severe. Men were physically diminished and mentally frayed. The plan to push farther northward toward the Coppermine coast and then back again required faith in a supply chain that had already shown itself unreliable. Staying put held its own hazards.
The Admiralty's expectations, a tidy report, charts to display in Whitehall, accolades for bravery, did not, in the moment, help to feed a hungry mouth. Choices had to be made amid uncertainty. A particular date marks the end of one phase and the beginning of another in the expedition's timeline. June 4th, 1821, appears in the records as the day the party made a decisive movement toward the Coppermine. They had reached the Great Slave Lake and established that Fort Enterprise would be the staging ground for a push north. Yet the confidence with which that decision was taken in London was not matched by the reality in the field. The men embarked on the northward leg carrying less than ideal stores, old gear, and a mounting burden of mistrust. The psychological ballast of earlier friendship and esprit de corps had been lightened by the winter's privations. The landscape ahead, plains of rock and lichen, rivers running to the Arctic, offered no obvious remedy for such human deficits. Even as the expedition prepared to move, rumors and accusations followed like a cold wind. The journals record that some men grumbled openly about unfair distribution. Some officers worried aloud about the conduct of voyageurs whose loyalty was divided by pay, by cultural ties, and by the immediate logic of survival. The tension between naval command and local practice, between the Admiralty's timetable and the season's slow economy, was reaching a turning point. Supplies that had been counted on for the retreat were uncertain. The men who had been counted upon for guidance were exhausted. The social fabric of the group showed thinning threads. It is here, poised between achievement and collapse, with the map partly drawn, but the men who drew it dangerously depleted, that the story of the Coppermine Expedition deepens into its most disturbing phase. Choices would be made not only about routes, but about whom to trust, whom to hold accountable, and how to act when moral rules forged in calmer places no longer seem to apply. The record that follows includes charges and countercharges, a death whose circumstances remain contested, and an atmosphere in which accusations could mean the difference between life and death. At the edge of the barren lands, as canoes were repaired and last caches inventoried, small pockets of action foreshadowed the events ahead. Men who had been quiet became more furtive. A few were bolder in hunting parties. Others were seen to consume extra rations. Richardson wrote of the men eating whatever they could procure, a phrase that both documents fact and hints at the slide in social norms. When a single man returns with meat while others starve, the simple arithmetic of calories is quickly transmuted into moral arithmetic. Is the man a rescuer or a thief? Is he pragmatic or cruel? These are the questions that would define much of how the Coppermine Expedition was remembered.
The journals, being what they are, fragmentary, sometimes inconsistent,
always composed under stress, do not allow for clean verdicts. Instead, they provide the evidence that allows historians to assemble interpretations, to weigh testimony, and to acknowledge the limits of what can be known. That methodological humility is essential, because to treat the accusations that emerged as settled facts would be to overstep the sources. Yet to scrub the narrative clean of suspicion and fear would be to sanitize the lived experience of those months. As the summer days lengthened, Franklin and his officers decided on the next phase, a push to the Coppermine to fulfill their orders to chart the coastline. The decision was as much strategic as it was psychological. Accomplishment could restore honor, or so the argument ran. Maps could justify hardship. But the material state of the expedition limited options. Canoes were patched with care, clothing was mended with the priority reserved for the most essential crew members, and above all, each mouth's intake of dried meat, flour, and whatever fish could be caught was counted and recounted. History often turns on such counting. The ledger is not simply financial, it is moral. The journals that served as the expedition's ledger were both a practical tool and a moral record. Lines in neat ink connecting supply with outcome, hunting yields with survival rates, and decisions with their consequences. They are rigorous in tally and human in tone. Reading them, one sees not only how many pounds of flour remained, but also how the men reasoned about sharing, about punishment, and about the use of force when confronted with theft. It is in this context that the figure of Michel becomes central in the pages that follow. Not because he was exceptional among voyageurs, but because the sequence of allegations that gathered around him crystallized the expedition's deepest fears, that scarcity could corrode trust into violence. The journals note, with the degree of specificity available, instances where Michel returned from the bush with meat, where he perhaps said inconsistent things about sources, where others observed discrepancies between what he claimed and what evidence suggested. For some in the party, these actions were straightforward theft. For others, they were the desperate measures of a man trying to survive. The events that would follow, a death, an accused hoarder, and an act of lethal force claimed later to be self-defense, do not present themselves on the page as a tidy cause-and-effect sequence. Instead, they arrive as a set of linked incidents, each recorded with the partial clarity of witnesses under duress. Richardson's accounts, Hepburn's annotations, and the cramped notes of other men combine to form a mosaic. The mosaic suggests patterns of suspicion, of crime, of punishment, but also leaves gaps and contradictions that would be pressed upon by later critics and apologists alike.
By the time the expedition turned its face back toward Fort Enterprise to retrace steps and consolidate, the stress lines in the party had hardened into discernible fault lines. Some men had lost weight to the point of visible frailty. Others had developed a look of persistent watchfulness. The boredom and monotony of portage had been replaced by a brittle alertness. Every tent flap, every food barrel, every movement of a man into the bush carried social meaning. The possibility of violence became not merely a theoretical worry, but an operative reality. In that landscape, a single shot would echo far beyond its literal sound. And yet, amid this gathering storm, the men continued to record latitude, longitude, specimen names, sketches, and the tiny human notes that bridged scientific rigor with survival narrative. Those entries preserve the paradox of the Coppermine Expedition. Even as the social fabric frayed, the mission of mapping and observation continued. That tension, between the preservation of knowledge and the corrosion of social trust, is what makes the story both historically consequential and morally unsettling. It is at this juncture, with the party wearied, the routes half-mapped, and suspicion circulating like a cold fog, that the expedition's narrative moves towards its most contested scenes. Decisions made in the coming weeks would determine who lived and who died, who was blamed and who was forgiven, and how the story would be told once the survivors reached York Factory and then England. The records that remain give us a powerful but incomplete lens, the facts of movement, the detail of rations, the clinical notes about injuries, and the uneasy, sometimes accusatory notations about human behavior. From these, a historian must assemble explanation without overreach. For now, as the canoes are mended and the men count their remaining pounds of flour and tuck away the journals that will later be read in a different climate, the expedition stands poised. The map ahead shows both promise and peril. The men who sign their names in cramped script on those pages do not yet know how their own acts will be judged. They do not yet know which of them will be celebrated in Whitehall and which will be suspected, whispered about, or written into marginal notes of controversy. What they do know is that the next months will demand more than courage. They will demand a kind of moral resourcefulness that is not guaranteed in any kid list.
If this episode already feels like the shadow of a larger, darker story, there is reason. The Coppermine Expedition is not simply an account of travel. It is an investigation into what happens when institutional objectives collide with the limits of human endurance.
In the months to come, the record will show both concrete acts and the slippery realm of suspicion. Allegations that survivors later made, actions later portrayed as necessary, and the question of whether deeds done in extremity can be judged by peacetime standards. The answers are not obvious, and the evidence is not decisive. But the sequence of decisions, of lost caches and damaged canoes, of hoarded meat, and a man shot in the back, creates a narrative arc that moves inexorably toward crisis. The Coppermine Expedition had already produced maps and scientific notes that would later be recognized as valuable. But value on a map does not pay for a man's life. The choice to press on, to believe in the Admiralty's aims, despite meager provision and errant promises, was the choice that placed lives on a ledger. To understand what occurred, we must keep our attention on both the maps and the margins, on charted coastlines and on the cramped lines of the journals that describe men eating boiled leather and repairing canoes while winter comes early. On July 14th, and then again on August 22, entries note progress and setbacks. On September 26th, the party makes position reports that will later be used by the Admiralty. By October 20 and October 29, the cold nose of winter is biting. November 1st and December 11th appear as dates marked by deprivation and by decisions to move or to hunker down. The timeline is not a mere sequence of numbers. It is the heartbeat of a journey that keeps time with the seasons and with the diminishing appetites of the men who undertake it. And yet, even as days are numbered and maps extended, the human story presses forward. For every chart plotted, there is a face mapped into a memory. An officer whose sketch would never be completed. A voyager who would be pointed to in accusation in later years. A guide whose generosity would make rescue possible. The moral geometry of the expedition is complex. The same Arctic that produced data also produced deprivation. The same relationships that facilitated travel were also strained by scarcity. At the edge of this first phase, as canoes are lashed and packages sealed for the northward push, the party is thin. Decisions are fraught. Trust has been eroded. And the question that will drive the most painful sequences of the voyage hangs in the air. When does survival justify actions that, in calmer times, would be judged criminal? The answer would be debated long after the men were back in England, and it would shape how the Coppermine Expedition was remembered, as a valiant attempt at discovery, as an administrative failure, and as a story of the human limits tested to their edge. The expedition moves now into the fixed and open country beyond Fort Enterprise, where the next acts, the mapping to Point Turnagain, the descent into the barren lands, and the series of events around a man named Michel and the death of Robert Hood will unfold. What happens next will force us to confront the thinness of recorded truth in the face of human desperation, and to ask whether an Admiralty's ambition can ever be disentangled from the suffering of those sent to realize it. They reached the coast at last. After weeks of grueling travel and the slow arithmetic of survival, Franklin's party pushed out onto the Arctic shoreline and began the precise work their orders had demanded, charting the unknown. For all the private privations and public anxieties, the men fulfilled an important portion of their mission. Over the course of that summer, they surveyed roughly 675 miles of coastline, taking bearings, sketching headlands, and laying down the coordinates that would later appear in Admiralty reports. The achievement was technical and undeniable, latitude and longitude that disciplined an angry, indifferent geography into usable knowledge. Point Turnagain, so named when the party chose to halt their northward push and begin the return, stands as the expedition's bitter high watermark. There, on a narrow strip of Arctic beach, men recorded the position where the practical limits of their craft met the ecological limits of the coast. They had reached the point orders demanded and science prized, and yet the cost of that success was accumulating in ways that charts could not capture. Canoes were patched beyond ideal repair. Clothing, mended and layered, no longer protected as it once had. The mapped coastline glittered as a memorial to both accomplishment and strain. The decision to turn back was strategic,
but the retreat across the barren lands was anything but controlled. The landscape changed from the more forgiving waterways to an openness that punished every delay. Rivers ran shallow and choked with shoals. Portages lengthened and became places where both bodies and equipment were worn down. Canoes, often lashed and carried, were damaged on unseen rocks. A shredded hull meant not simply lost gear, but lost time. Days that in that latitude corresponded to dwindling rations and a narrowing window for safe travel. Supply failures that had once seemed manageable became existential. Flour stores that had held the group together now read like a ledger of choices already made. The journals register the new diet with the same clinical eye they used for latitude. Lichens and moss boiled in thin soups, strips of leather softened to a chewable state. The grim phrase that would enter later legend, "men eating their boots," appears among the reports as evidence of the improvisations forced by hunger. Richardson's pages catalog these improvisations not for melodrama but as data: calories consumed, materials ingested, hours of effort expended to reach a hunting ground. It is in this pressured landscape that the social fabric began to tear in faster motion. The proximity of death shortens time for deliberation and extends time for suspicion. The journals begin to mention caches found tampered with, smoked meat gone from its store, men seen returning from the bush with the harvest of a hunt that did not match the size of their parties. When supplies are finite and travel is slow, the act of bringing home meat acquires immediate moral meaning. Was the hunter a providential savior or a private profiteer? Michel's name is recurrent in these marginal notes, and it is here that the record becomes entangled with the psychology of accusation. Several accounts, principally Richardson's, Hepburn's annotations, and other officers' entries, report instances in which Michel returned to camp with meat while others struggled to find game. Some survivors later described him as evasive about sources. At least one officer interpreted his behavior as hoarding. The problem historians face is that these notes were taken under stress, often in cramped conditions, and with fatigue curdling judgment. They are evidence, not verdicts. They show what people believed and feared in the moment. They do not, on their own, prove motive. The death of Robert Hood crystallized the fear into something that could be seen, weighed, and mourned. Hood was young, tasked with recording the expedition visually, and his loss struck a particular chord: a creative man murdered in the midst of a scientific enterprise. He was discovered with a fatal wound, shot in the back, and the immediate responses in the journals are puzzlement and sorrow. Some entries try to frame the shot as an accident. Others allow that the circumstances are ambiguous. The wound's location and the events leading up to it were subject to immediate speculation in camp and intense debate thereafter. What followed was a cascade of suspicion and defensive action. In the hours and days after Hood's death, the survivors tightened camp routines, increased watch rotations, and conducted informal inquiries. When allegations of theft concentrated around certain individuals, tensions rose. At one point, according to contemporary entries, Michel was suspected of taking meat from a cache. He was detained by members of the party, questioned, and later released after conflicting testimonies. Those episodes, recorded in terse language, suggest not a judicial proceeding, but an improvised attempt at maintaining order in a setting where formal authority is limited by circumstances. Then came the most explosive event of the retreat, an encounter in which Richardson himself shot Michel. The journals describe the killing with the same reserved factuality that marks other entries. A man returned to camp with meat. Others confronted him. A confrontation occurred. A shot was fired. Michel died. Richardson's explanation, recorded and repeated by some of his peers, was that the act was committed in the context of perceived danger, an act of self-defense under extreme conditions.
Later accounts emphasize fear. Men thought a group might be planning to take secret supplies or to harm officers to redistribute food. Richardson claimed he acted to prevent imminent violence. Critics and some contemporaries were less convinced, seeing in the shooting either an excessive use of force or the culmination of escalating mistrust. Across all accounts, one central caution remains. The sources are written by survivors whose perspectives were shaped by exhaustion, hunger, allegiance, and fear. Where Richardson writes clinical detail, others write accusation or defense. Where Hepburn notes a sequence of movements, another hand supplies a conjectural motive. Historians who sift these notes must do so with care, indicating where testimony is first-hand but partial and where interpretation overlays fact. The question of cannibalism, perhaps the most lurid charge that later readers attach to stories of Arctic expeditions, must be handled with similar caution. Contemporary journals contain disturbing indications of what men ate to survive: boiled leather, lichens, sometimes parts of animals deemed unpalatable in ordinary times. In later retellings, that evidence was compressed into a claim that survivors consumed human flesh. But the primary records are equivocal. They contain rumors, second-hand assertions, and the kind of speculation that spreads when appetite and fear intersect. Some later commentators and popular accounts inferred cannibalism from sparse or suggestive entries. Others point to passages about eating boots and treat them as metaphorical expressions of hunger. The safe scholarly position, and the one reflected in the most careful readings of the journals, is this. Survivors suspected and some alleged cannibalism in the years that followed, but the documentary trail stops short of unequivocal proof. It is a contested charge, and it must be presented as such. The party's internal fractures, the fatal shot, and the suspicions that followed did not in the end prevent rescue, but rescue arrived in a pattern that underscored the importance of the local networks the Admiralty had treated with ambivalence. Acaicho and his people, who had aided Franklin before and continued to do so when they could, played the decisive role in the expedition's final survival. In late 1821 and into 1822, Yellowknife hunters arrived with meat and supplies that staved off further deaths. Their arrival was not a miraculous reversal of fortune, so much as a demonstration of sustained reciprocity. Relationships forged in trade, mutual dependence, and earlier exchanges of goods and gestures. Without that aid, the outcome could have been far worse. The return to York Factory, and eventually to England in October 1822, produced a public narrative that preferred heroism to complexity. Franklin's maps and the scientific collections he brought back were lauded.
In London, the Admiralty used the expedition's technical results to bolster its narrative of discovery. Charts were published and specimens catalogued. Public receptions emphasized the endurance and enterprise of naval men confronting a hostile environment. In private, however, the reception was more ambivalent. George Simpson of the Hudson's Bay Company, who had his own institutional grievances and priorities, criticized Franklin's planning and the reliance on company stores. He argued that the expedition's mismanagement was foreseeable and avoidable. Historians since have treated Simpson's attack as both politically motivated and revealing. It exposed the fragile interplay between imperial ambition and the realities of northern logistics. The survivors faced divided reputations. Franklin would go on to be promoted and to command further missions. His later 1845 expedition and disappearance would cement his fame in a different register. Richardson continued his scientific work and wrote an account that remains one of the key primary sources for the Coppermine voyage. Others, those who had been involved in the contested incidents, found themselves shadowed by suspicion in ways that shaped later careers and reputations. The event that stands most starkly in memory, the shooting of Michel, the death of Hood, the accounts of boiled leather, became part of a charged story that mixed valor and moral ambiguity. What then is the Coppermine Expedition's legacy? It is multiple. On one hand, the mission produced precise maps and natural history notes that advanced British and European understanding of the Arctic. The data collected would be used by future navigators and scientists. On the other hand, the expedition illustrated a pattern: Admiralty zeal paired with underfunding and a willingness to depend on commercial networks whose motives did not always align with exploration. It revealed how fragile human order becomes under sustained scarcity, and how accusations in extremity can harden into reputations. There is also a moral lesson about reciprocity and recognition. The Yellowknives, led by Acaicho, were not mere footnotes. Their guidance, hunting, and decisions to bring help were decisive. To frame the Coppermine story solely through European suffering is to miss a crucial truth. The expedition's survival depended on indigenous expertise that colonial institutions too often made conditional or treated as ancillary. Later critics of the Admiralty would point to that dynamic, how imperial projects rely on local knowledge while offering uneven compensation and praise. The Coppermine voyage is thus a case study in the ethical economy of exploration. When we look back from the vantage of Franklin's later fame and eventual disappearance in 1845, the earlier Coppermine disaster reads in two ways. It is a prelude that reveals patterns, logistical missteps, the cost of ambition, and the human vulnerabilities of men in extreme environments. It is, too, a lesson in narrative construction. The same man who would later be celebrated and mourned also presided over a voyage marred by death and contested actions. The later mythology smoothed edges. Primary journals show them intact. So why call this, as the title insists, Canada's most disturbing expedition ever? Because the Coppermine voyage forces us to look at the unadorned economics of exploration. Promises made in metropolitan chambers could be lives lost on tundra. Scientific gain could be braided with personal tragedy. And the thin line between survival necessity and criminality could be crossed in ways that left no easy records. The story is disturbing not for theatrical gore, but for what it reveals about institutional hubris and human frailty, the way ambition can set people into a situation where moral certainties dissolve. If the story sustains us, it is because those journals are stubbornly human. They record latitude and meteorological readings alongside the details of what men did to stay alive, and how they blamed one another when blame became a strategy for survival.
They show us that exploration is not merely a chart on which a line is drawn, but a social experiment conducted in extreme conditions. They remind us that maps and medals can coexist with grief and accusation. The Coppermine Expedition ended with lives saved, with charts returned, and with reputations complicated. It left a residue of questions about responsibility, about the role of local allies, about the ethics of command, and about how history chooses its heroes. Those questions would resurface in the public imagination with Franklin's later disappearance and the search efforts that followed, an irony of history in which an earlier failure became the seedbed for a more famous mystery. If there is a final image to linger on, it is not a sensational one, but a quiet, unsettling one. A frost-rimed journal, its ink running in places, the careful hand of an officer who had measured angles by sextant and calories by ration book, placed beside the worn moccasins and patched canoe ribs that enabled him to get home. The map and the margin exist together. One records what was discovered, the other keeps the tally of what was paid. If this account has raised questions or struck a chord, the original journals, Richardson's notes, the officer's entries, and the contemporaneous company records are available for deeper study, and links to those sources are in the description below. If you want more investigations like this, deep dives into the human stories behind the maps, consider supporting the channel on Patreon or subscribing for future episodes. And tell us, which buried expedition should we unearth next?